In the pantheon of World War II figures, few are as complex, contradictory, and ultimately tragic as Admiral Wilhelm Franz Canaris. He was not a frontline commander leading fleets into battle, nor a charismatic dictator rallying the masses. He was a spymaster, a man who operated in the shadows, and his story is one of the war's greatest enigmas. For he was the chief of the Abwehr, Nazi Germany's military intelligence agency, a man who held one of the most powerful positions within the Third Reich while simultaneously becoming the quiet, beating heart of its resistance. To understand his fateful warning about American air power, one must first understand the man himself, a German patriot serving a regime he loathed, navigating a moral labyrinth where a single misstep meant a traitor's death. Canaris was an unlikely figure for such a dark and demanding role. Short, balding, and with a preference for casual civvies over imposing uniforms, he was often described as resembling a mild-mannered professor or a tired businessman. He was a man of simple, almost ascetic personal habits, whose greatest joys were found in walking his two Dachshunds, Seppel and Sabine, around the streets of Berlin. This unassuming exterior, however, concealed a mind of formidable intelligence and a soul tormented by profound moral conflict. He was a career naval officer, a staunch German nationalist, but he was never a Nazi. His conservatism was rooted in an older, Prussian tradition of duty and honor, one that recoiled in horror from the vulgar, violent thuggery of Hitler's movement. His journey from loyal officer to active conspirator was a slow, painful awakening. The initial signs of the regime's brutality, the night of the long knives in 1934, sickened him. The escalating persecution of the Jews, culminating in the Kristallnacht pogrom of 1938, solidified his opposition. He saw the war itself as a catastrophic folly that would destroy the Germany he loved. And so, from his powerful perch at 7276th Terpitzufer, the Abwehr headquarters, he began a dangerous double game. His agency became a sanctuary for dissenters and a headquarters for conspiracy, all operating under the very nose of the Gestapo. His chief of staff, the fiercely principled General Hans Oster, became his primary accomplice. Together, they transformed the Abwehr into a weapon against the state it was meant to serve. Their methods were ingenious and audacious. They systematically sabotaged the Nazi war effort by manipulating the intelligence that reached Hitler and the High Command. Reports on enemy strength were deliberately pessimistic, warnings of Allied capabilities were downplayed or muddled. When the Abwehr intercepted critical information, such as key details about the D-Day landings, Canaris ensured it was delayed, poorly presented, or discredited before it could influence strategy. He was playing a strategic game of deception, not against the Allies, but against his own government. His travels to neutral Spain and Switzerland, ostensibly for Abwehr business, were often covers for clandestine contacts with Allied intelligence agents. He sent out fragile, tentative feelers for a negotiated peace, hoping against hope to end the war before Germany was utterly destroyed. Every one of these meetings was an act of high treason, punishable by hanging. To survive, Canaris cultivated an aura of eccentric incompetence. He would play the bumbling, confused old man in meetings, rambling about obscure historical parallels while his sharp mind processed every detail in the room. This carefully constructed persona was his perfect shield. When an Abwehr operation failed, it could be dismissed as the admiral's ineptitude rather than his deliberate sabotage. He walked a razor's edge every single day, surrounded by a web of suspicion spun by his arch-rival, the ruthless head of the SS Intelligence Service, SD, Reinhard Heydrich. The Abwehr and the SD were locked in a silent, vicious war for control of Germany's intelligence apparatus, a war where Canaris's defeatism was Heydrich's greatest weapon. This was the man who, in early 1943, surveyed the global battlefield with a clarity his master in the Wolf's Lair utterly lacked. The tide had turned. The catastrophe at Stalingrad had just concluded, the frozen corpse of the German Sixth Army a grim testament to Hitler's strategic madness. In North Africa, Rommel's forces were on the brink of collapse. Canaris, with his unique access to global intelligence and economic assessments, understood that the war was entering a new, terrifying phase. It was no longer a contest of tactics or morale, but of raw, industrial production. And from across the Atlantic, he saw a storm gathering, a storm of steel and aluminum on a scale that defied German comprehension. It was this understanding, born from his unique position as both an insider and an outsider, that propelled him toward his fateful confrontation with Hitler. The spymaster in the Nazi heart was preparing to deliver his most truthful report, knowing it would likely be his last. While the Third Reich waged war with a terrifying blend of ideological fervor and military precision, a different kind of war machine was stirring across the Atlantic, one whose scale and logic existed outside the comprehension of the Nazi leadership. This was their arsenal of democracy, a phrase that barely captures the seismic industrial revolution it represented. By early 1943, this arsenal was not merely supporting the Allied war effort, it was becoming the single most decisive factor in the conflict. To understand why Admiral Canaris was so alarmed, and why Hitler found his warning so laughable, one must abandon all conventional notions of warfare and step into a world where production numbers themselves were weapons. The foundation of this effort was a combination of geography, resources, and economic might that no other combatant could match. The United States was a continent-sized nation, its industrial heartland protected by two vast oceans. Its factories operated around the clock, free from the threat of aerial bombardment that would soon cripple German and Japanese industry. It possessed seemingly limitless natural resources, the oil of Texas, the iron ore of Minnesota's Mississippi Range, the coal of Pennsylvania. This security and abundance allowed for a continuous, unimpeded production cycle that was pure fantasy for the war economies of Europe and Asia. The heart of this aerial armada was not a secret wonder weapon, but the relentless, almost mundane, efficiency of mass production. The numbers, even today, defy belief. The centerpiece of this effort was the B-24 Liberator, a four-engine heavy bomber that was the backbone of the strategic bombing campaign. At the Ford Motor Company's purpose-built Willow Run plant in Michigan, a factory so colossal a journalist quipped it had a horizon of its own, a completed B-24 rolled off the line every 63 minutes. This single facility would eventually produce 8,685 of these complex machines. To put that in perspective, Germany's total production of all four-engine bombers for the entire war was less than 1,500. The scale was not incremental, it was exponential. But the bombers were only the most visible part of the avalanche. They required a vast ecosystem of support. At the Republic Aviation Plant in New York, the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt fighter rolled out by the thousand. At North American Aviation in California, the legendary P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that would ultimately win the daylight air war over Europe by escorting bombers all the way to their targets, began its own journey down the assembly lines. Alongside these, tens of thousands of training aircraft, transport planes like the indispensable C-47 Skytrain, and naval aircraft poured forth from a nationwide network of factories. In 1943 alone, the United States would produce over 86,000 aircraft. The figure of 50,000 that Canaris cited was not an exaggeration, it was, if anything, a conservative estimate for a single year's output. This was not merely a triumph of airframe construction. It was a feat of coordinated logistics and standardization on an unprecedented scale. The country mastered the art of production by the mile. Tires, engines, propellers, radios, and .50 caliber machine guns were produced in separate, specialized plants and flowed in a constant stream to the final assembly lines. The entire nation was retooled. Automobile factories switched from building cars to tanks and aircraft engines. Typewriter companies produced machine guns. The collective effort, mobilized under the galvanizing shock of Pearl Harbor, showcased the raw power of American capitalism and engineering when focused on a singular, national objective. Crucially, the United States was not just building planes, it was building an air force. This required the most complex component of all, the human one. The nation established a pilot and aircrew training program of such vastness it resembled a parallel university system. Civilian flight instructors, using a fleet of over 10,000 civilian aircraft, provided the initial training to hundreds of thousands of young men. They then progressed through a network of specialized schools for bombers, fighters, and navigators. This system was designed to produce not just pilots, but complete, combat-ready crews, along with the ground mechanics, radio men, and armorists needed to keep them in the air. The Tuskegee Airmen, despite facing systemic racism, emerged from this system as one of the war's most elite fighter groups, a testament to its scale and depth. This was the terrifying reality that Canaris's intelligence network had pieced together from economic reports, agent dispatches, and neutral observers. It was not a speculative threat for the distant future, it was a present, unfolding fact. The 50,000 planes were not just numbers on a page, they represented a strategic paradigm shift. They meant that the United States could afford to lose thousands of aircraft and still grow its air force exponentially. It could wage a war of attrition that would grind any opponent into dust. The Nazi leadership, trapped in an ideological bubble, dismissed this as propaganda. They believed in the primacy of the German will, the qualitative superiority of their engineering, and the decadent weakness of their foes. They were preparing for a duel, while the United States was building a factory to produce an infinite supply of swords. Canaris saw the blueprint for that factory. He knew that willpower, no matter how fanatical, shatters against such overwhelming, industrialized force. The explosive confrontation in the Wolf's Lair was not a simple disagreement over military intelligence. It was the climactic moment where the fundamental schism at the heart of the Third Reich was laid bare, a collision between the empirical world of fact and the solipsistic world of ideology. Hitler's furious rejection of Canaris's warning, culminating in the shrieked insult, "You are a fool," was not an impulsive outburst, but the logical endpoint of a leadership cult built on delusion, a fatal rejection that would echo through the remaining years of the war and seal the fate of millions. To understand the fury, one must first understand the foundation upon which Hitler's power was built, the concept of Willenskraft, or willpower. In the Nazi worldview, the strength of National Socialist conviction, the purity of Aryan blood, and the genius of the Führer could overcome any material obstacle. This was not mere rhetoric, it was a deeply held article of faith. A German soldier, imbued with this spirit, was inherently superior to his enemies. A German engineer, inspired by the party, could achieve miracles of production that decadent democracies could not comprehend. The report of 50,000 American planes was not just a strategic assessment, it was a direct challenge to this core dogma. Accepting it meant admitting that the inferior American system, a melting pot of races they despised, possessed a strength that German will could not match. For Hitler, this was blasphemy. The environment of the Wolf's Lair itself fostered this rejection. By 1943, Hitler had increasingly surrounded himself with sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear. The most damaging of these was Hermann Göring, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. Göring had staked his personal prestige and power on the invincibility of his air force. He had famously boasted, "No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr. If one reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Göring." To accept Canaris's figures was to admit his own failure and the bankruptcy of his leadership. Consequently, Göring was the chief architect of the delusion within the inner circle, consistently dismissing reports of Allied production as insane fantasy and reassuring Hitler of the Luftwaffe's qualitative superiority. The rivalry between the Abwehr and the SS Intelligence Service, SD, further poisoned the well. The SD, led by the scheming Ernst Coltenbrunner after Heydrich's assassination, often provided more palatable, ideologically aligned intelligence that reinforced Hitler's preconceptions. Canaris, the bearer of bleak, analytical truth, was easily painted as a defeatist by his rivals. When Canaris presented his meticulously gathered data, he was therefore attacking not just a strategic position, but an entire identity. Hitler's rage was that of a prophet whose revelation is being questioned. He did not dissect the number 50,000. He did not ask about types of aircraft, production timelines, or the logistical capacity to deploy them. He attacked the messenger. The accusation of being a fool was carefully chosen. In the twisted logic of the regime, it was not that the information was wrong, it was that only a fool, a man of weak will and poor judgment, could believe such things. It was an ad hominem attack designed to destroy the credibility of the information by destroying the credibility of the man who delivered it. The immediate consequences for Canaris were severe and personal. The public humiliation marked him as a man whose influence was at an end. He was effectively sidelined, his intelligence reports increasingly ignored or filtered through their more reliable SD. The Abwehr itself, already under a cloud of suspicion for its failures and its chief's lack of ideological zeal, was now mortally wounded. Their fool verdict gave Himmler and Kaltenbrunner the ammunition they needed to finally dismantle the independent military intelligence service and absorb it into the SS, which they would do the following year. For Canaris, it was the beginning of the end, setting him on a path that would lead to dismissal, house arrest, and finally, execution at the Flossenburg concentration camp in the war's final days. But the consequences for Germany were far more catastrophic. Hitler's rejection of the warning was a strategic decision of historic proportions. It meant that no fundamental change in strategy or industrial priority would be made to counter this existential threat. Resources were not massively reallocated to fighter defense. The development of the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter was fatally delayed by Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber. The German war economy, despite Albert Spee's remarkable efforts, continued to produce a diverse array of complex weapons rather than focusing single-mindedly on the one thing that could stave off annihilation: a vast, modern air defense force. This fatal rejection granted the Allies the most precious commodity in war: time. Unmolested by a fundamental shift in German strategy, the American and British air forces continued their buildup, perfected their long-range escort tactics, and planned the systematic destruction of the Reich. The skies over Germany, which Hitler believed his will could protect, were left undefended against the coming storm. The phrase, "You are a fool," was more than an insult. It was an epitaph for the Luftwaffe and a death warrant for German cities. The true folly was not in speaking the truth, but in a leadership so blinded by its own mythology that it could no longer see the disaster it had summoned. The explosive confrontation in the Wolf's Lair was not a simple disagreement over military intelligence. It was the climactic moment where the fundamental schism at the heart of the Third Reich was laid bare, a collision between the empirical world of fact and the solipsistic world of ideology. Hitler's furious rejection of Canaris's warning, culminating in the shrieked insult, "You are a fool," was not an impulsive outburst, but the logical endpoint of a leadership cult built on delusion, a fatal rejection that would echo through the remaining years of the war and seal the fate of millions. To understand the fury, one must first understand the foundation upon which Hitler's power was built, the concept of Willenskraft, or willpower. In the Nazi worldview, the strength of National Socialist conviction, the purity of Aryan blood, and the genius of the Führer could overcome any material obstacle. This was not mere rhetoric, it was a deeply held article of faith. A German soldier, imbued with this spirit, was inherently superior to his enemies. A German engineer, inspired by the party, could achieve miracles of production that decadent democracies could not comprehend. The report of 50,000 American planes was not just a strategic assessment, it was a direct challenge to this core dogma. Accepting it meant admitting that the inferior American system, a melting pot of races they despised, possessed a strength that German will could not match. For Hitler, this was blasphemy. The environment of the Wolf's Lair itself fostered this rejection. By 1943, Hitler had increasingly surrounded himself with sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear. The most damaging of these was Hermann Göring, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. Göring had staked his personal prestige and power on the invincibility of his air force. He had famously boasted, "No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr. If one reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Göring." To accept Canaris's figures was to admit his own failure and the bankruptcy of his leadership. Consequently, Göring was the chief architect of the delusion within the inner circle, consistently dismissing reports of Allied production as insane fantasy and reassuring Hitler of the Luftwaffe's qualitative superiority. The rivalry between the Abwehr and the SS intelligence service, SD, further poisoned the well. The SD, led by the scheming Ernst Kaltenbrunner after Heydricher's assassination, often provided more palatable, ideologically aligned intelligence that reinforced Hitler's preconceptions. Canaris, the bearer of bleak, analytical truth, was easily painted as a defeatist by his rivals. When Canaris presented his meticulously gathered data, he was therefore attacking not just a strategic position, but an entire identity. Hitler's rage was that of a prophet whose revelation is being questioned. He did not dissect the number 50,000. He did not ask about types of aircraft, production timelines, or their logistical capacity to deploy them. He attacked the messenger. The accusation of being a fool was carefully chosen. In the twisted logic of the regime, it was not that the information was wrong, it was that only a fool, a man of weak will and poor judgment, could believe such things. It was an ad hominem attack designed to destroy the credibility of the information by destroying the credibility of the man who delivered it. The immediate consequences for Canaris were severe and personal. The public humiliation marked him as a man whose influence was at an end. He was effectively sidelined, his intelligence reports increasingly ignored or filtered through the more reliable SD. The Abwehr itself, already under a cloud of suspicion for its failures and its chief's lack of ideological zeal, was now mortally wounded. Their fool verdict gave Himmler and Kaltenbrunner the ammunition they needed to finally dismantle the independent military intelligence service and absorb it into the SS, which they would do the following year. For Canaris, it was the beginning of the end, setting him on a path that would lead to dismissal, house arrest, and finally, execution at the Flossenburg concentration camp in the war's final days. But the consequences for Germany were far more catastrophic. Hitler's rejection of the warning was a strategic decision of historic proportions. It meant that no fundamental change in strategy or industrial priority would be made to counter this existential threat. Resources were not massively reallocated to fighter defense. The development of the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter was fatally delayed by Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber. The German war economy, despite Albert Spee's remarkable efforts, continued to produce a diverse array of complex weapons rather than focusing single-mindedly on the one thing that could stave off annihilation, a vast, modern air defense force. This fatal rejection granted the Allies the most precious commodity in war, time. Unmolested by a fundamental shift in German strategy, the American and British air forces continued their buildup, perfected their long-range escort tactics, and planned the systematic destruction of the Reich. The skies over Germany, which Hitler believed his will could protect, were left undefended against the coming storm. The phrase, "You are a fool," was more than an insult, it was an epitaph for the Luftwaffe and a death warrant for German cities. The true folly was not in speaking the truth, but in a leadership so blinded by its own mythology that it could no longer see the disaster it had summoned. The dismissal of Admiral Canaris's warning was not a simple error in judgment. It was the product of a coherent, self-reinforcing system of thought, a logic of delusion that governed the Nazi high command. To an outside observer, rejecting such a concrete, verifiable threat seems irrational. But within the ideological fortress of National Socialism, Hitler's response was perfectly logical. His refusal to believe was an act of ideological self-preservation, a necessary defense mechanism against a reality that would have invalidated the very foundations of his worldview and his claim to power. At the core of this delusion was the Nazi concept of Weltanschauungskrieg, the worldview war. This was not a conflict over territory or resources alone, it was a metaphysical struggle between opposing cosmic forces. On one side stood National Socialism, representing Aryan creativity, willpower, and spiritual purity. On the other stood the forces of Judeo-Bolshevism and plutocratic capitalism, represented by the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain. These enemies were not just political adversaries, they were depicted as biologically and spiritually inferior, corrupt, and decadent. Their strength, according to Nazi dogma, was hollow, a mere facade of material wealth lacking the spiritual core that gave true power. This ideological framework created an impenetrable cognitive filter. Any information that suggested these inferior races could achieve something beyond German capabilities, like producing 50,000 advanced aircraft, was not processed as a factual report. It was processed as ideological contamination. To accept it would be to admit that the entire Nazi racial hierarchy was wrong, that their worldview was flawed. Therefore, the information had to be false. It could only be enemy propaganda, designed to weaken German resolve, or the product of a mind that had itself been corrupted by these alien influences, a mind like Canaris's, which Hitler now labeled a fool. This system was reinforced by the very structure of the Nazi state. Hitler had deliberately created a chaotic governance model of competing fiefdoms, a system of divide and rule that prevented any single subordinate from accumulating too much power. This meant that Canaris's Abwehr was in constant, bitter competition with Heinrich Himmler's SS intelligence service, the SD, for control of information flow. The SD, staffed by true Nazi believers, understood that their power depended on telling the Führer what he wanted to hear. They consistently produced reports that downplayed Allied capabilities and exaggerated German victories. When Canaris presented his bleak assessment, he was not just delivering data, he was losing a bureaucratic battle. His defeatism was a weapon his rivals could use against him, and Hitler's fool verdict was their ultimate victory. The system actively selected for sycophancy and punished truth-telling. Furthermore, Hitler and his inner circle, particularly Hermann Göring, suffered from a profound technological and economic arrogance. They believed in the myth of German qualitative superiority. A single German Tiger tank was worth 10 Allied Shermans. A German soldier, with his superior training and racial spirit, could defeat multiple enemy soldiers. This belief was extrapolated to the air war. They were convinced that the skill of a German pilot in a Focke-Wulf FW-190 or a Messerschmitt Bf-109 could overcome a numerical disadvantage of 5-1 or even 10-1. They failed to grasp the new American doctrine of warfare, that overwhelming quantity, when applied with strategic purpose, itself becomes a devastating quality. They were still thinking in terms of a chivalrous duel, while the United States was pioneering industrialized annihilation. There was also a critical failure of imagination regarding the United States itself. The Nazi leadership viewed America through a lens of racist caricature. They saw a weak, degenerate nation, fractured by racial conflict and softened by consumerism. They believed its people were incapable of the discipline and sacrifice required for total war. The idea that this mongrel society could out-organize, outproduce, and outfight the disciplined, technologically advanced Third Reich was not just incorrect, it was an ontological impossibility within their belief system. Their contempt for American culture blinded them to its awesome industrial and democratic potential when unified by a common cause like Pearl Harbor. Finally, for Hitler personally, accepting Canaris's warning would have meant confronting his own strategic catastrophe. The war against the Soviet Union was his personal decision. The declaration of war on the United States was his personal decision. To admit that these foes now possessed the capacity to utterly destroy Germany was to admit that he, the Führer, had led his people to ruin. His ego could not tolerate this. It was psychologically easier to dismiss the facts, to shoot the messenger, and to retreat further into a fantasy where a secret weapon or a sudden fracture in the Allied coalition would still deliver victory. The logic of delusion was, in the end, a psychological refuge from an unbearable truth. It was a fortress of the mind, and its walls were so high that not even the roar of 50,000 aircraft engines could penetrate them. The tragedy for Germany was that its leaders' personal psychological defense mechanisms had become the nation's strategic policy. While the echo of Hitler's fool verdict still lingered in the corridors of power, the first tangible manifestations of Canaris's ignored prophecy began to take shape in the skies over Western Europe. The year 1943 marked the end of the phony war in the air and the beginning of a systematic, industrialized air campaign the world had never witnessed. The sky was indeed darkening, not with weather, but with the gathering armadas of the Allied air forces, the vanguard of the 50,000 plane fleet whose existence Hitler had refused to believe. This was not yet the full, overwhelming force, but its initial waves were enough to fundamentally shift the strategic balance and prove the ABWA's intelligence tragically correct. The initial American doctrine had been one of unescorted, daylight precision bombing. The belief was that tight formations of heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses could fight their way to industrial targets deep inside Germany and back, destroying the Reich's war-making capacity with surgical strikes. This theory was tested to destruction in a series of brutal battles in the latter half of 1943. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August and the second Schweinfurt raid in October became synonymous with carnage. On what would be dubbed Black Thursday, the U.S. 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17s out of a force of 291, with over 600 airmen killed or captured. The Luftwaffe's defenses, comprising interceptor fighters and a lethal carpet of anti-aircraft flak, proved that unescorted bombers, no matter how rugged, were devastatingly vulnerable. Yet, this tactical defeat contained the seeds of strategic victory. Unlike the German High Command, the Allied leadership did not dismiss painful facts as defeatism. they adapted. The staggering losses over Schweinfurt provided irrefutable proof of what was needed: a long-range fighter that could escort the bombers all the way to their targets and engage the Luftwaffe on its own terms. The solution arrived in the form of the P-51 Mustang. When paired with external fuel tanks, this agile, powerful fighter had the range to fly to Berlin and back. By the end of 1943 and into early 1944, squadrons of P-51s began to appear in the skies over Germany, their silver wings slicing through the formations of German defenders that had previously slaughtered the bomber streams with impunity. This was the turning point, the moment when American quantity began to achieve a decisive qualitative edge. The arrival of the Mustangs changed the very nature of the air war. It was no longer a one-sided slaughter of bombers, it became a fierce battle of attrition against the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. The experienced, battle-hardened German pilots who had been the backbone of the defense were now being killed at an unsustainable rate. They were not just being shot down, they were being systematically hunted. The numerical superiority foretold by Canaris was now being felt not as a distant threat, but as a daily, grinding reality. The Luftwaffe was bleeding itself white. Simultaneously, the British Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, under Sir Arthur Harris, waged its own form of aerial warfare under the cover of darkness. While the Americans pursued daylight precision, the British specialized in nighttime area bombing. Using advanced navigation aids like G and oboe, and later the radar confounding window, chaff, their vast streams of Lancaster and Halifax bombers visited destruction upon German cities on a scale previously unimaginable. The firestorm unleashed upon Hamburg in July 1943, Operation Gomorrah, offered a terrifying preview of the future. The incendiary inferno created a self-sustaining meteorological phenomenon, killing over 40,000 people and devastating one of Germany's most important port cities. For the first time, their home front, which Hitler had promised would remain safe, was experiencing a taste of the total war it had unleashed upon others. The psychological impact on the German populace and military was profound. The myth of the Reich's inviolability was shattered. The constant wail of air raid sirens, the shudder of the earth under thousands of tons of high explosives, and the terrifying searchlight beams piercing the night sky became the new normal. Morale, which Hitler believed was unshakable, began to crack under the relentless pressure. For the Nazi leadership, the darkening sky was a direct repudiation of their dogma. The will of the German people was being broken not by enemy soldiers, but by the very industrial output they had mocked. By the dawn of 1944, the air war had achieved its first major strategic objective: air superiority was within grasp. The Luftwaffe was reeling, forced to conserve its remaining fighters for the defense of their homeland. German industrial output was being disrupted, and the civilian will to resist was being systematically eroded. The first waves of the storm had proven Canaris right. The 50,000 planes were no longer an abstract number in an intelligence report, they were a present and growing force, and their shadow was falling ever longer across Fortress Europe. The stage was now set for the final, devastating act, the full unleashing of the aerial armada that would pave the way for D-Day and pound the Third Reich into submission. By 1944, the isolated skirmishes and costly probing attacks of the previous year had coalesced into an unending, continent-spanning aerial offensive. The prophecy that had earned Admiral Canaris the Führer's contempt was now a daily, deafening reality. The figure of 50,000 planes was no longer a future projection to be debated in a bunker, it was the operational reality governing the skies from the English Channel to the Polish border. The United States Army Air Forces and Britain's Royal Air Force had matured into a single, coordinated instrument of destruction, their combined might fulfilling their fool's forecast with a precision that was as methodical as it was merciless. The air armadas had arrived, and their mission was the systematic dismantling of the Third Reich. The cornerstone of this final, devastating phase was absolute air superiority, achieved by the early spring of 1944. This was not merely the absence of enemy aircraft, it was the total domination of the airspace. The P-51 Mustang, the weapon born from the lessons of Schweinfurt, was the key. No longer did German fighter pilots enjoy the luxury of lining up defenseless bomber formations. Now, they were hunted by swarms of agile, long-range Mustangs whose pilots were under orders to aggressively seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found, in the air, on the ground, over its own airfields. The result was catastrophic for the German fighter force. Experienced squadron leaders, the irreplaceable backbone of any air force, were killed in droves. Replacements were rushed to the front with barely enough training to take off and land, only to be shot down on their first few missions. The Luftwaffe was not just being defeated, it was being annihilated as a coherent fighting force. This hard-won control of the skies was the essential precondition for Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. In the months and weeks leading up to the invasion, the air armadas executed one of the most successful strategic deceptions in military history, the transportation plan. Thousands of sorties were flown not against factories, but against the French railway network. Locomotives, marshalling yards, bridges, and tunnels were systematically destroyed. The goal was to isolate the Normandy battlefield, making it impossible for the Germans to rapidly reinforce their coastal defenses. The plan worked flawlessly. When the landings came, German panzer divisions like the feared 2nd and 116th were stranded hundreds of miles from the front, their movement crippled by the shattered transport links. The Allies had effectively built an air bridge to protect their invasion force, a bridge built with bombs and maintained by the relentless presence of thousands of aircraft. With the invasion secured, the full, terrifying weight of the air armadas could be brought to bear on Germany's industrial and economic heart. The campaign shifted to a twin-pronged assault of breathtaking scale. The first prong, and perhaps the most decisive, was their oil campaign. Recognizing that the German war machine was a motor that ran on synthetic fuel, Allied intelligence pinpointed the refineries and hydrogenation plants that converted coal into gasoline. These facilities, such as the massive complex at Lunar, became the most heavily defended and frequently bombed targets in Europe. The results were immediate and paralyzing. By the autumn of 1944, German fuel production had been reduced to a trickle. Pilot training was virtually halted. Tanks and trucks sat idle, their crews becoming infantry for lack of fuel. The Wehrmacht, once the most mobile army in the world, was being systematically immobilized from the air. The second prong was the destruction of German industry and cities. While the USAF continued its daylight precision campaign against specific factories producing ball bearings, aircraft, and weapons, RAF Bomber Command maintained its nighttime area offensive. Cities like Cologne, Essen, and, tragically, Dresden, were subjected to firestorms that erased centuries of history and killed hundreds of thousands. The moral calculus of this campaign remains debated, but its strategic impact is undeniable. It shattered the German home front, created millions of refugees, and stretched civil defense and emergency services to the breaking point. The production miracles orchestrated by Albert Speer were first slowed, then halted, and finally reversed by the sheer tonnage of high explosives raining from the sky. By the war's final winter, the prophecy was not just fulfilled, it was exceeded. The skies over the dying Reich were a permanent panorama of Allied air power. On any given day, 1,000 bombers or more, shepherded by hundreds of fighters, would drone deep into Germany, meeting only sporadic, token resistance. The Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies. The industrial base lay in ruins. The cities were rubble. The 50,000 planes that Hitler had dismissed as a fantasy had become the architects of his empire's doom. The roar of their engines was the sound of Canaris's vindication, a grim, posthumous symphony for a spy master who had seen the future with perfect clarity. The air armadas had not just supported the victory, they had, to a large extent, achieved it long before Allied tanks crossed the Rhine.